job is going to be to keep everyone awake and engaged. So as Samir said, my name is Maitreyi, and I have a very august panel here with me. I have President Boris Tadic. He is the former president of Serbia and a very well-known authority in terms of regional cooperation and in terms of furthering globalization. We have Ibtisam Al-Ketbi. She is the founder and president of the Emirates Policy Center at the UAE, the first woman to have led a think tank in the Arab world, and has won many, many awards. We have Filani Mtembu, and he is Executive Director, Institute of Global Dialogue in South Africa. So welcome. We have Ratin Roy, whom you heard this morning as well. He is Director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy from India, and a very eminent economist. And finally, but not the least, we have Stefan Klingbeil, who is Director of Global Policy Center in Seoul. It's a UNDP outfit, and he was in Germany just before that. So thank you, everybody, very much, and thank you to my audience for being here. I'm kind of taking it slightly slow to start with, just because I'm waiting for people to stream in. But as they're streaming in, let me introduce the topic. And this is the idea of, when I first looked at this topic on globalization, people, institutions, and ideas, it seemed like it was everything. It seemed like it was everything in the kitchen sink. And then things started to fall in place from this morning, when we had a series of excellent presentations, including by Sanjay at the beginning, where he's really questioning the idea of globalization. Has globalization gone too far? Is it on the decline? Is it a new globalization? And many of us have been exercised with this question as to where globalization is going. Which seemed to be against some notion of globalization, more towards a more parochial national identity rather than a global identity on the one hand. And yet there are others who are clamoring for greater global integration. So it seems, as Danny Roderick sort of calls it, somewhat of a paradox. And Danny Roderick, of course, is someone who believes that globalization went too far. On the other hand, there are eminent thinkers and writers from Africa. My ex-managing director from the World Bank, Ngozi, who was the former finance minister of Nigeria, who recently wrote in the Project Syndicate saying, globalization, the old globalization, actually left Africa behind. And so the globalization that we know having taken place, and I realize I'm using the past tense here pretty deliberately, seems to have fallen short, and we're in the process of sort of rethinking and reinventing globalization. So with that somewhat dispersed set of ideas in terms of where we are as far as globalization is concerned, I'm going to turn to my panel, and I'm going to start with you, Stefan, and I'm going to ask each of you to give me, in about 3 minutes, what is your view of where globalization is at right now, and where do you see it going? 3 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, everybody, to this most exciting panel. Let me raise maybe 5 points within 3 minutes, and you give me feedback at the end. So first of all, I take globalization as a fact. Yeah, it's taking place. Climate change is taking place. Migration as a challenge for Europe, for Northern America. This is taking place. The question I would like to highlight is really, do we have the capacity to manage with the consequences of globalization? And in this regard, just as a first general point, I think our ability in terms of collective action is declining. Just looking at the Paris Climate Agreement, I think this is a quite clear case. My second point is collective action is something where we have to have focus on intergovernmental relations, yeah? United Nations and many other platforms. At the same time, and I think this is something what we saw over the last couple of decades, we understand that we can only manage those challenges if we bring in all relevant actors. So social media nowadays, civil society, of course, private sector, think tank institutions. So it's really key, if you are talking about collective action, that this is not just about government-to-government discussions. My third point, you see I'm really quickly doing this, my third point is I think taking into account that we need to bring in this kind of diverse group of actors, we need to have the ability for what is called orchestration, so to bring together those actors. And let me just highlight two very concrete examples where I think we can learn from. One is C40. This is a group of 40 cities dealing with climate change actions. So it's taking place on the subnational level. So subnational level is really something what is crucial. Last week I had a meeting in Seoul with the assistant mayor in charge of infrastructure. Seoul is such a huge actor in this regard. This is not about tiny things, but even if you are looking at the village level, etc. So this is one example. The other one, which I find quite interesting, is IT's the extractive industry initiative, which is, I mean, there are always weaknesses and flaws, etc., but they are able to bring together those companies, but also civil society representatives. My fourth point is collective action should include development cooperation. I mean, there's always the risk that development cooperation actors try to find good reasons why to continue, but I think we have several advantages. We have expertise how to implement projects. We have, to some extent, resources. We know how to deal with different and challenging situations like fragile countries, post-conflict situations, etc. And just to give you, again, two very concrete examples where I think we can learn from. Rwanda is always a front runner. You might have heard about the Rwandan Cooperation Initiative. I had, just as a sideline, a nice meeting this morning with the Rwandan Cooperation Initiative. And Rwanda Cooperation Initiative is doing a new type of South-South cooperation. Rwanda is still a least developed country, and they are now a South-South cooperation provider in a very innovative way. And I would say what my center in Seoul is doing, development solution partnerships, is also very concrete in this regard. So we have a number of examples in this regard. My last and very quick point is I think we should think about some kind of upgrading of development cooperation to something what I would call global cooperation in support of SDGs or Agenda 2030, because we need transnational cooperation, not just between North and South or South and South, but also North and North and other ways. So my thinking would be just let's try to overcome this kind of binary system of development cooperation and think about global cooperation in support of SDGs, and this is something what is relevant to all countries on the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Feedback on the time?
I'll let you know.
Oh.
No, you're doing well on time. Thank you. No, thank you very much.
Almost facing a crisis of confidence. For the past, decades, they led these processes, led the multilateral fora, advocated for open markets, advocated for greater interconnectivity and so forth. But throughout that process, you've got the rise of actors that are undergoing internal crises. Them wants to, raise barriers and go at it alone and renegotiate everything. It will create a crisis because of because the US is a significant actor. If Europe starts looking more inwards, it will have an impact because it's a significant player in the world. But countries of the South are no longer necessarily waiting for the US or waiting for Europe. They're simply forging ahead. I mean, if you look at, just a quick example, the number of acquisitions of Western companies by countries that are essentially, if you map them, along the Belt and Road. Whether it's countries in Asia, whether it's countries in the Middle East, companies that are basically buying, Western companies. Whether you go to France and you go to those, old vineyards, and you find out those vineyards are now owned by a person in China or a person in the Middle East or so forth. It's creating certain crises of confidence, I think, within those societies, which are leading those societies to actually turn increasingly inwards, and by doing that, they create then the narrative of a crisis in globalization. But I think that even in itself is not enough to actually stop that momentum towards greater interconnectivity. And I think the next phase of globalization will not necessarily be led by the traditional actors who led it in the last few decades, be creating a bit of a crisis in the traditional centers of globalization.
Brilliant. So you're really placing it within from the perspective of Arab think.
First, let me thank the opportunity. This is my first time in Africa. This is the first country I visit in Africa, in a beautiful country. Well, I think the globalization, it is in fragility. With Brexit, with the election of Donald Trump, and also the growing phenomena of terrorism combined by the wave of refugees, populism, has achieved more victories in election, especially in Central Europe. So the question now about the future of globalization started to occupy large space in international database. So isolationism and identity politics feed extremism and consolidate struggle and destructive wars. So this means that there is a clash sometimes, and in some countries, between domestic national policies and common values that call for globalization. So in this regard, I think we should focus on the need to re-act national institutions, laws, standards and orders, and reconsider them to face these new challenges on the international landscape. So if the essential point here is the need to work effectively to reform globalization. We need to, globalization is going, it's taking its place. You cannot stop globalization. But how to reform globalization and exert innovative, creative efforts to prevent defeats in front of populism, racist tendencies, and narrow policies. Now, Klaus Schwab talked about creating a new global architecture. In my view, this means that we should include the following. The architecture should be environment-friendly, that can address the problem of climate change and pollution, and ensure that consumption patterns do not harm natural resources or ecological balance. I was last week in Rhodes, a really unique initiative taken by Yukon University from Connecticut, and it talked about Abrahamic tradition and global change, where it's talking about the three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and get from them the culture, how to educate people to preserve and protect their nature, which is really, it consists of people from environment, educators, many interesting people discussing this interesting topic. So the other thing I think we should consider the social security networks and ensure sustainable economic growth. So this structure will be surely effective and successful as long as it maintains a correlation between growth and development on one hand, and advancing social justice and combating corruption on other hand. You cannot stop globalization, but you can reform globalization.
Excellent. You've actually touched upon 2 or 3 of the issues of globalization that were presented to us as a challenge for this session. And those 3 were about economic growth, about inclusive growth, inclusive societies, and about climate change. So you've touched upon in your remarks each of those 3 in a sense. I'm going to turn to President Tadic last after I ask Ratin on where you've heard your other fellow panelists, and we've had a bit of a conversation before. In terms of your reflections, where do you see this? Where do you see this going?
Sure. Thank you. Well, let me start by presenting to you a very simple truth, which is a truth that an economist should know if they've been to grad school at all, which is that the globalization that you saw in the 90s and 2000s was a very partial globalization, because it involved the movement of everything but people. So you had an imperfect movement of people, a highly restricted movement of people in terms of the very word we use, emigration. People are factors of production. Why can't they move like goods, services, bananas, capital? So the argument there was for free movement of goods and services and therefore free trade, and the free movement of capital. And these were the sort of new things that came with WTO and others. But the free movement of people was kept profoundly silent. And there I want to agree with my African colleague that the Global South has always been profoundly interested in globalization using its assets, which is the free movement of people. And the unspoken crisis of globalization today is what you see happening to ships entering Europe. What you saw last week from Delhi, First World War closed, and 2 days before my flight left, Iranian airspace was closed. I don't think we've seen closure of airspace except for 6 hours in 9/11, other than when we had war and disturbance in the Middle East, and then 2 for brief periods. So obviously this happy movement of labor and capital, when you start having naval ships, the Persian Gulf, when you have a situation in the South China Sea and talk of the Indo-Pacific, I'm an amateur student of naval history, and never, ever capital ships in the Pacific and in the South China Sea as you have today. No, not never, ever, not since about 1914, pre-1914. Not so many, no, not 11 aircraft carriers, 3 of ours, 2 of the Australians. So you have this reality of war, and that is also, I think, making people a bit nervous about how globalization can go. So I'm afraid the solutions sitting in Kigali, to conclude, are going to have to be solutions that force the easy wine-sipping talk that happened in Davos, Klaus Schwab's dream of globalization amongst a bunch of elites, very small numbers of elites from our countries, very large numbers of elites from their countries. That's going to have to change, because these ugly realities, which are 20th century realities, are upon us in the 21st century. And we will have to navigate globalization based on these realities, which is why I think fewer and fewer people bother going to Davos anymore, and more people come to places like Kigali. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the reason I'm going last with you, President Tadic, is because you've been hearing about a lot of the shift of power relations, whether it's aspirational or it's real or it's a bit of both. From the perspective of Europe, do you see an acknowledgement of this shift in power relations? Do you see an acknowledgement and a need for Europe to be better integrated with the rest of the world on a footing that it previously was not? And if so, sort of, what are your views in terms of, clearly the conversation that's going on in Kigali seems to be very much at variance with conversations that may be going on in various European capitals. Ratin mentioned the movement of people. Ibtisam also mentioned movement of people. And that's at the crux of what's going on in Europe right now. So your thoughts on this, please.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very interesting and very significant forum. This is not the first time that I'm in Africa, but the first time that I'm in Rwanda. I'm really happy to be here and to share my views with you. When you're asking me about Europe, it's not easy to define Europe.
No, of course.
I'm coming from the country which is not member state of European Union, but international arena, many people are considering Europe as a European Union.
Yes.
But also Balkans, which is mentioned, is an origin of Europe.
Exactly.
Russia is Europe.
Yes.
Especially European part of Russia, which is not considered as a real country of Europe. I'm talking about European culture and think tanks and the people that are analysts that are taking into consideration the global development. If you're asking me whether Europe is taking that kind of changes seriously, is European Union, is Europe at whole, is able to understand global perspective and the new global architecture, I can say not enough. Europe is a small peninsula on which 500 million people are living, maybe more if you are taking into account countries that are not member states. They are living in the most secure part of the globe, even now. And this is bringing even intellectuals in a very comfortable situation. Not to think always clearly, but to be very relaxed. But things are changing so fast. And those changes are bringing to us so many challenges and very dangerous situations. Those changes can be for benefit for all, but also for totally different scenarios. In that direction, I see European Union which is involved in the internal conflicts. Yesterday, we didn't know who is going to be a leader of European Commission. Nowadays, we see unpredictable person which is going to take that very significant position. Take into account that European economy at whole is the largest global economy, but Europe is not participating in international arena as a European Union economy. They are participating in international arena separately. But I see even today, when things are so clear that only big powers in the future are going to be very important as decision makers, and that even the strongest European economy, which is German economy, is not going to be able to compete with other players in the next 10 years, I see reaction of European Union leaders and think tanks not very responsible to the situation they are facing with. Things are changing so fast, things are getting unpredictable, things are getting very dangerous. We are living on the crossroads. China is taking over a position that China always deserved in the history of mankind, except the period after invention of James Watt. But this period of history is over. India is coming immediately after China. This is only about India. It's up to India to decide whether to become global power or not. This is not anymore about United States and European Union to decide who is going to be global power. And we are going to live in such a world. And why European Union leaders are that inactive in that respect, I don't have a crystal clear answer. If I were in their shoes, I would be much more active. especially regarding challenges we are facing together.
Let me give you a follow-up to that. If you were to be much more active in the direction that you're saying, you would lose elections today in Europe. What do you think is going on with the populism?
Okay, this is a crystal clear that populists are becoming very successful on elections. Maybe this is outcome of rising influence of the social medias also, when everyone can make comment on everything, even not very responsible people. And in that environment, populists are getting stronger. But I have to remind ourselves, and me too, that we had an oscillation of populism in the history of mankind. At the beginning of the 20th century, we had a populist everywhere on the European continent, not only Hitler and Mussolini. Some of them took a power through democratic elections. We have to be very serious on that issue, which means democracy is not guarantee assurance that normal people are going to come to the power. Nowadays, we have a process that I cannot compare with the Nazism and fascism, but we see very dangerous people that are on the power in some European countries. I am saying that this is vertical. This is very specific line from the Baltic Sea towards Mediterranean and also towards Turkey. I mean, Poland, Hungary, my country, region of the Balkans, Italy, with the Salvini nowadays and the situation with Erdogan in Turkey. So many populists. But when I'm criticizing them on international forums, they are saying, but what about United States? And yes, driving force of democracy, pillar of democracy, is facing with such leadership. And in that respect, I'm making jokes on international forums, trying to wake up people and to be more provocative. I'm asking people, okay, you have a kid 2 years old, you have to give your kid to someone who is going to care about him in the next 2 years. And you have 3 choices: Donald Trump, Xi Jinping, or Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. And I'm asking you, it's not easy. Only 1 decade ago, mostly people were clear on that issue. Nowadays, no one is mentioning Donald Trump. No one. And I understand people that are not mentioning Donald Trump. And this is the situation in which we are living. This is not about kid 2 years old. This is about whole world. And all kids around the world in totally unpredictable situation. For intellectuals, this is a paradise for you to be analysts, to take into consideration our makers. Kate, from the position, that's interesting to me nowadays. But I'm making jokes.
No, it's true. It's true. Analysts can sit and analyze. Politicians actually have to do something.
Yeah.
But the process of globalization, whether in the past or currently, or quasi-globalization, has always been at the heart of it a political process. There's no doubt about it. So, Filani, let me turn to you. For forcibly displaced people due to any number of reasons, how do you see the buzz around Africa, whether people are really actually acknowledging and coming to terms with the fact that actually the action is here?
Well, I think, if you just look, in the last 20 years or so, of all the fastest growing economies in the world, at least 6 or 7 of them have been African economies, right? Now, we can debate the low base they've been growing from, we can debate the distributional effects and so on and so forth. But there's no natural law which dictates that in the last 20 years that 6 or 7 of the fastest growing economies should have come from Africa. And I think we need to look much closer into what is happening within the continent to actually encourage